Hello, everybody. Welcome to a webcast from the Strada Education Network. I'm going to give it just a minute or two for folks to arrive, so sit tight. Seeing a decent number of people still showing up, so let's give it one more minute. Thank you for your patience. Alrighty, we're going to get started. Lots to cover in this one. Welcome to the Public Viewpoints webinar, Reconnecting Recent High School Graduates with Their Education Aspirations. I'm Paul Fain, your moderator. Appreciate the invite from the Strada Education Network to moderate this one. I'm a longtime higher ed journalist, now covering connections between education and work with a newsletter called The Job. We're here to talk about what I know I don't need to tell any of you is one of the biggest challenges I think our nation faces coming out of the pandemic, which hopefully we are coming out of the pandemic. How to reconnect with high school students who have drifted away from education, recent high school graduates, particularly low-income students. As I think most of you know, this is a contributor to declining enrollments, particularly among low-income students at community colleges. Just to cite a couple recent numbers before we turn to the findings from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, traditional college-age students 18 to 24 this spring declined 5% in US enrollments. That's more than 524,000 students, including a very steep loss of 13.2% or more than 365,000 students at community colleges among this traditional age group. So we're going to look at some findings about these folks and how to reconnect with them. Dave Clayton, as Senior Vice President of Consumer Insights for Strada, will walk through the findings. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with Tammi Chun, Interim Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Hawai'i Community Colleges, which serves the entire state with 7 colleges throughout the islands. And then Ann Stanton, President of the Linked Learning Alliance, the engine that drives the linked learning movement, which is a national coalition of educators, employers, and community organizations dedicated to success for all students. So during that panel discussion, we're going to be taking your questions. So please enter them in the Q&A down there, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. And we'll leave some dedicated time at the end. And just one more piece of housekeeping, you all will get a link to the recording of this as well. So without further ado, because I know we have a lot to cover here, I'm going to turn to Dave for the findings. I think you're muted there, Dave.
Hopefully that does the trick. Thank you, Tammi and Ann, and thank you, Paul. And really thank you to the team that's worked on this. As you know, we've been doing this now for since March of 2020. And there's a group of individuals who work tirelessly and with great passion to try and help all of us as a community understand how to serve the people of our nation and help us deliver on the promise of education and training after high school. In particular, you know, we continue to learn and grow as we hear from you as an audience. So if there are questions you have that you would like to see further research and tracking on, put those in the chat or send us emails. One thing we've done and added this month, Dr. Nicole Torpey-Sabo and Dr. Melissa Levitt have written a full brief, a narrative brief that you'll find on our website of the findings that are here today, in addition to the slides we'll review now. So lots of resources, more data than we can explain to you in this time, but I'd like to highlight a few things that'll help Tammi and Ann and all of us have a conversation together today. I've thought often over the past year of the Dream Deferred poem. Langston Hughes in Harlem, and thinking about the impact on individuals' lives and the transition and inflection points and what it means to be pursuing and have hopes and aspirations, and what it does when external events and circumstances, certainly a lack of equity that exists historically, but compounded in the times of this pandemic, and what that's doing to young people across our nation. And so we wanted to really get close to these young people and their insights and understanding in the service of not describing the train wreck and the tragedy, but of understanding the hope and the strength and the needs of these individuals. And this started 2 months ago when a group of national experts gave their time and came together and said, here's what we think the solutions are. Here's what we're trying to do in our communities and our organizations. And we took those solutions, we packaged them and presented them to these disrupted students, individuals in the high school graduating classes of 2020 and 2021, who said they had expected and planned on going forward with post-secondary education, but had decided not to do that right now. And we wanted to understand their circumstances, but also their hopes and aspirations for the future and what they thought would be most helpful. And that's what we'll really center our conversation around today. This sample is not nationally representative. We went out and found over 1,200 individuals who raised their hand and said, yes, I wanted more education, but I've decided not to right now. So you'll see these numbers, 19% of the people who kind of responded to this online survey invitation said from the class of 2020, we're from the class of 2020 and disrupted students, 17%. Now, America's Promise Alliance released a nationally representative survey today report looking at current high school students, and they found that 16% of current high school students said they had decided not to pursue post-secondary education. So the numbers are close, but this is really a deep dive on understanding these disrupted students. At the end of the survey, we asked these 1,200 individuals to type in and write the 3 words and explain how they're feeling about the future of their education and their lives. I'll give you some samples. We won't read all these at you or to you. You'll find them in the report and the materials. But here's someone, class of 2020 graduate, living in Arizona. Living 2021 student in West Virginia, employed full-time, has a financial support role in their household. Neither of their parents have college degrees, and she's confused, obligated, and stressed. Doesn't know what she wants to do, concerned about the debt. Yet this second sentence, I feel obligated because the only real way to make livable money is to get a higher education. No money, no family, no support. Grades didn't do as well last year, but she's stuck in that middle. I'm obligated if I want a livable wage to get higher education, but how do I do it, right? So you think of where she is sitting right now, working full-time, helping support her family and her future and hopes. You see the annoyed, overwhelming, and indecisive. This sense of feels as if it's the only choice for higher education, post-secondary education, but pointless at the same time. Again, this tension of I want it, I believe in it, I know it's supposed to, but will it deliver on the promise for this individual? There's so many optimistic young people, right? Someone in Iowa, class of 2021, working half-time, part-time, parents without college degrees. I'm excited and hopeful and confident. New things, even trials, sharpen you and make you better. It will still all work out for me. I'm confident in that. So that resilience and that hope and that dream that's still alive in her life. And so these just go on, and you can absorb and review these as they come through across the nation. But this notion, I was never that good in school, and I'm worried about the debt for the rest of my life. Right? Can I be successful as a student? And what burden will I carry if I'm not successful and it doesn't translate into that future? So this is where these individuals are sitting. In their own words, the bind and the challenges and the hopes that they have and where they sit. What that's meant, where we look at how the disconnection has taken place across these 2 years, you see that even for the class of 2020, I looked down at that second row from the bottom, received an acceptance letter from a college or program. 40% of those young people from the high school class of 2020 who decided not to attend had an acceptance letter. They had a path forward. They had a tangible, real opportunity, and they chose not to because of their concerns. And then naturally, we'd all expect with the timeline of the pandemic, that disconnection and disruption started so much earlier for the class of 2021, as you see them taking less of those active steps. And that's all just context for as we reach out and go to support and serve these individuals in these communities, realizing that not all of them are starting at the same place, and the importance of listening to them individually and addressing their needs and experiences. We actually see that the students of color, Black and Latino disrupted students, have gotten a little farther than their white peers in the process, more likely to apply to college or other programs, 9 and 10% more likely, right in the middle there, more likely to have applied for financial aid, that bottom row. So they're not, again, thinking of communities and aspirations and signs that there's hope and interest alive, even when there have been choices not to pursue at this time. We asked them what the largest influence on their decision not to get more education was. And I just continue to be astonished at the pervasiveness. We often, in our circles and our efforts and our engineering to try and improve systems and outreach, we think about, broadband and internet and financial aid, and the feelings of stress, anxiety, uncertainty, the lack of the ability to predict and plan is so prevalent. Nearly 2 in 5, 39% of these disrupted students said that was the biggest reason, is just this underlying sense of I'm not sure and I'm worried and I'm concerned. The financial pressure, very real, coming in at number 2 for a quarter of these students. And then we see these other things that we all would assume and expect that show up in the impact on their lives. Some differences by race and ethnicity. You see white students reporting more of the general, stress, anxiety, and uncertainty. You see financial pressure on my family at 62% for Latino students being significantly higher. You see the concern about the health risks of attending and participating in post-secondary education, 43%. So again, higher for Black students, and the need to care for others. So you start to get some sense, again, of differences across communities and the distribution of burdens and challenges that are experienced that we need to be aware of as we look to construct solutions. A snapshot of where they are presently, right? COVID-19 made it harder too. The biggest gap, and here we're looking at on the left-hand side of these bars in the lighter blue, are disrupted students who are not low income. The majority, 47% of this sample, self-identified as being from a middle income family, and 41% self-identified as being from a low income family. And so you see this disproportionate challenge that the low income disrupted students feel around all of these areas, but particularly information about how I could pay for education after high school. And so that 26%, you said it's the main barrier, right, is the financial circumstances. And then this is the hardest thing for them that COVID has disrupted or made it subjectively more difficult for them to understand how they could pay for education. This links to what they say would be most helpful as we turn to in a moment, but only a half of these individuals agreed with the statement, I know people who can help me find a way to get the education after high school that's right for me. So that notion of social capital and the resource and the person, the advisor, the connection to listen, to believe, to understand, help navigate. Really half of these individuals don't feel they have that. And again, disproportionately, white disrupted students at 56%, lower access and belief in having those advisor and social capital resources amongst Black and Latino students as we think about And Ann and Tammi in a few minutes will talk about some of their efforts with these communities and what they've been experiencing. Looking ahead, this is probably where I feel like much of our challenge lies, and we see this trend consistently across audiences, is softness in the belief on the far right that education will be worth the cost, questioning its value and return. So less than half of these disrupted students are agree that it will be worth the cost. Their challenge is not, if you look to the left, in a belief that education will help them get a good job. We saw those in those quotes earlier from West Virginia and other places, right? 69% believe that education will help them get a good job. And even nearly 2/3 believe they will be successful as students. So if you believe it will help in the long term, and you believe you can be successful in education, but you're not sure it will be worth the cost, we need to do some translation between the grand promise and your potential and of the education and the specific plan for you and how that leads to the pathways and the outcomes. Back to that belief that I know someone who will help me find the education that is right for me, that will turn into the work and the employment and the opportunities I'd like and can see. 3 in 10 said that my plans for education have not been changed by the pandemic. But if we look at other changes, and again, consistent with other research that you'll see coming out even today, 1/3 would look for a less expensive program as they seek to enroll than they would have before the pandemic. Nearly 1/3 would say, I'll look for a place closer to home, changes in majors, changes in programs, and a small group that say, I just won't enroll. You look again and see a trend for both Latino and Black students, with the sample size statistically significant for the Black students to be more likely to say, I'll look for a less expensive alternative and I'll look closer to home for additional education. And then if we think about what would be most helpful when we're trying to get more education, they identified a handful of things. These are rank ordered. So every point means it's that much more. Meet other students at the very bottom, 2.6%. When they say college and program communication, 5.6%, people are ranking that as twice as helpful as meeting other students. And an advisor is twice as helpful as college and program communication. So you see at the very top that notion of the social capital, the advisor, the guidance, the navigation being the very most helpful, 4 times more than meeting other students and nearly that for summer prep programs. They're looking for that advisor. Real interest in understanding how to earn and learn, to keep earning and learning. 42% of these individuals are currently providing financial support in their households. 32% of them are currently providing care support to someone in their household. So they're actively already earning and working, and they are thinking about solutions that will help them continue with those responsibilities while pursuing the education aspirations they have. We talked about the financial aid and the easier access and understanding how to navigate that, how important that is. These align with some of the, as I mentioned earlier, the group of experts nationwide who came together and said, these are the things we should be doing, best practices. You know, under that guidance, the clear and consistent, the high school counselors and college counselors, training and mobilizing faculty, the affordability suggestions, the connection to career. And I think Ann and Tammi, again, will help us bring some of this to life in the real world that they lead and serve in. And then just key findings, and we'll bridge from here, but the stress, anxiety, uncertainty are very real and need to be addressed. As we're continuing to interview these students and do individual video interviews that we'll be sharing with you in coming weeks, one young woman I listened to yesterday talked about just having someone who would listen to her and not think she was dumb or stupid for asking obvious questions, or that, and not just give the answers that were the canned expected answers, but to really connect and understand her, was her plea and requests to us of how we could better serve her. The disruption is happening at different trajectories, and even one of our national experts talked about in Baltimore public schools, the remarkably low number of students that were actively attending even in the 9th grade. So we think of this disrupting not just today, but what does this mean for those who've had the disruption in their high school education over the past years? And then we highlighted some key supports, right? The guidance, the understanding of the affordability, and knowing how the education paths map to the career and life outcomes that they're aspiring to. So thank you. We've got plenty to work with here, but again, you'll find the details on our website so you can download and access these slides in the report. And really, Paul, we'll turn it back to you. And
thanks, Dave. Obviously, stick around. We'll want to bring you in for questions related to the findings as we go here. But now we're going to turn to our expert panelists. And for this first question, and let's start with Tammi, just curious what you're seeing in Hawaii, how it gels with these findings, what sort of research you've done with disconnected young folks and how to reach them.
These findings really resonate with what we're seeing locally. One thing I really wanted to point out here is the point that Dave made that the class of 2021 is more disconnected, or they disconnected earlier. And it's not just from the college process or the college going process, but they disconnected from high school as well. So as opposed to 2020, where seniors had gotten through most of the senior year before the COVID disruption, we're looking at students who have been not very engaged for quite a while. And so this is just sort of an extension of that level of disengagement, or a lot of students are telling us that they feel really jaded. I often hear, I need a break, and like, we're so over it for right now, and they just need some time. So we find that, more in terms of the college going activity from class of 2020, we definitely saw the trend that more students stayed closer to home. The University of Hawaii college going rates were fairly steady, even for our underrepresented populations. But what happened around the university, the in-state college going, was that fewer went out of state and fewer went to college. So, everyone, we have to be paying attention to not just our institutional numbers, but the context in which our young people are going to college or not going to college. So I mentioned that we had a major initiative last summer for the class of 2020, kind of on a dime, put together a program called Next Steps to Your Future, partnership of our K-12, higher ed, and community partners. Last year, Strada was a funding partner. This year, we're using Governor's Education Relief Funds to help fund the effort. And it's a summer program to help with college and career advising. So we have college and career counselors doing engaging with students and advising, and we have summer classes. So these are college success classes, but they're career focused around helping students plan for their future. And we saw a really different response from 2020 and 2021. So last year, pretty much on a dime, we stood it up, and about a quarter of the graduating high school seniors participated in our summer program. And this summer, we're seeing a very low uptake, so a little less than half of what we saw last year, and have done a lot of soul searching and a lot of looking at the data around what's happening, and really worried. So appreciate the findings. They're resonating. When I saw Dave's list of the different kinds of interventions that students said would help, I feel like 80% of them, like, we're throwing everything at them, and it's become, but our approach has been to listen as much as we can, try to take action. Just a couple of things I'd mention as that we're hearing. Students, this graduating class, they don't feel as curious about online learning. They feel often, I guess, jaded or discouraged by online learning experience that they had. So some of them are not interested in continuing on to online learning. So that's been a challenge. There's vaccination concerns, both directions. If you require the vaccination, then we won't come. And if you don't require the vaccination, we won't come. There's sort of no winning answer. So the latest outreach is to offer make sure we're pushing so that people who are interested know that we have an online option. Money is an issue. That came up in Dave's research. Someone had a question about FAFSA in the Q&A. And one thing I just mentioned here about FAFSA is that because FAFSA is asking for old tax records, that doesn't represent people's current situations. And so we all know as professionals that professional judgment can be used to adjust the financial aid package, but our high school graduates don't know that, and their families don't know that. So that is a challenge compared to the past. Money is always an issue, but I think it's especially a challenge to people who have had COVID disrupted family income. And then the last point I'll make here before handing off to Anne is that I think we saw this also in Dave's findings, that there's less support for this group of high school graduates. It was the social capital question as well. Like, we usually count on our high schools and our college outreach programs to especially reach out to students who are first gen to college or who are underrepresented. And perhaps what we're seeing is how important all that support is to helping our underrepresented students take the steps to go to college.
Thanks for that, Tammy. I really appreciate the reminder that this is not a situation where things are bouncing back quickly, and that further in the pipeline, as Dave said, in Baltimore schools, even ninth graders are feeling disconnected from high school. So Anne, what are you seeing at Linked Learning? Anything about the findings jump out at you as being either in line with what you found or maybe not?
Sure. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for the wonderful research, Dave. And Tammy's perspective is always incredibly insightful. You know, at the Alliance, we really focus on an education movement that is really encompassing about 250,000 young people in high schools, and ultimately really at the center of creating pathways that very deliberately create an intersection between college and career, right? With very rich student supports and great attention to building social capital and professional networks through work-based learning. So that I represent sort of the K-12, I think, perspective on what's happening. And so the research, it really resonates with the conversations we've had across California with young people who are in the midst of this perfect storm, right? And ultimately, you know, this is a crisis of disruption. And collectively, I think we're here to talk about how do we not turn a crisis of disruption into a crisis of disconnection, right? So ultimately, you know, we have listened very hard to young people and what they're saying. And, you know, as the research says, I mean, students are very anxious and they're very uncertain about their future. And they didn't get a lot of answers from adults about what they could expect. The rules were changing all of the time. And they were being pulled in their education pathways, but also in their personal lives to be, you know, breadwinners, to be caring for their siblings, to be, you know, taking on many, many different roles that help them, you know, support what was incredibly important to them, which was their families and their communities, right? So I think that they also really did reflect excitement and confidence too, that things could get better, but they were very clear about what they needed. And I think that's something that's important for us to think about as we move forward. What relationships were really critical, and I think that came through in the research. The relevancy of what they were learning in school as they were connected to Zoom boxes for an extended period of time. How did this relate to their aspirations? How did it keep them connected to purpose and passion? And were there opportunities for them to continue to be connected to the adults, their teachers, their mentors, work-based learning experiences, employers, counselors? All of those pieces were really important factors in our success when we had it to keeping young people very connected to purpose. And the other thing that I think is, and I know we'll talk more about it, I think there's so much work for us to do to break down the silos between our segments of education. You know, we have what happens in K-12, and then we have what happens in post-secondary. This is a time we have got to be looking at blended opportunities and really looking at accelerated and new ways of making these transitions absolutely seamless, if we're going to really not get to, I think, an outcome that we don't want, which is permanent disconnection.
Well, let's stick with the silo piece. I mean, we're talking about gaps between high school and college, and career, and specifically to the top barrier right now, the uncertainty, the anxiety, and frankly, the burnout that I think we've all felt, and I think all the students are as well. And any specific strategies you've seen that kind of cross silos that can give students the social capital they need to tackle those emotional pieces of this, or anything that you'd recommend folks here give a shot?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we know what the drivers of disengagement are. We've talked about them, right? I think young people do face tremendous obstacles navigating the transition from high school to college, right? And I think we very much need to keep listening to young people and raise their voices about what that transition feels like, that gap between these segments, and how do we make that easier to navigate, right? I think if we can accelerate opportunities, I think there is tremendous opportunity to look at how do we ensure that as we think about dual enrollment, we're really thinking about that earlier in a comprehensive way to accelerate young people's experiences and tie it to the relevancy of their connection and their career exposures. We hear from young people, you know, what's the purpose of higher ed, like to the end game of what's the cost to what the outcome is. And ultimately, we have to start earlier to help them see those connections. We can't wait till they walk into the door of college to do that. So ultimately, I think we have to continue to encourage, you know, engaging hands-on learning in high schools that really ties to work-based learning opportunities, that encourage self-agency and exploration of interests and creativity. I think we really need to purposely think about transforming what are now silos between these education systems, between higher ed, between K-12, between workforce, and really set equal tables to sit down and come up with solutions and stop the finger pointing about who's responsible for what. And I think that's something that we can make huge headroads with if we look at what we learn from evidence-based practices, what's working on the ground in both K-12 and in post-secondary and in workforce, and really connect dots in a way we haven't done before with a sense of urgency. I think all of those things can be very effective.
Great, thanks, Ann. Let's turn to Tammi, specifically building on what you just heard. And I wonder if you could also address the question of the channels to reach students, how to do that, and the challenges that you face there in Hawaii.
Yes, so thinking about what Ann said, I think that one of the things that we learned in the pandemic is that there's a group of students that are able and to apply to college and get there. So I think the Common App information tells us that more students applied to more colleges, even though fewer low-income students applied through the Common App this year. So I think my point here is to say that we need to look at which students need the assistance. Like there's a group of students that to me feel like they're on their way. They are finding their way through the process because the social capital they have or whatever resources they have to make that happen. But we're seeing a group of students who in the past or pre-pandemic would have probably gone to college that are not. And that's an important group that we've been trying to target during the pandemic. And then there's a group that we have struggled to reach and support all this time and need additional solutions. So I guess what I want to say is, yes, and we need to do things for class of 2021 and for 2020, go back and recapture them, as well as think about what are the systemic changes that we need to make for the upcoming graduating classes. So I think I'd mentioned to Paul earlier, one of my concerns about the class of 2021 is that we can tell from our data, they're not applying. I mean, that's what Dave's data told us. They're not applying, especially our low income, our Native Hawaiian, our Pacific Island students. They're not even getting applications in, they're not getting FAFSAs in. So how do we reach them now that they're out of high school? At least when they were in high school, we had a channel. We had directory information. They were somewhat connected to their high school, and now they're just out in the world. And now we have to reach them in a new and different way. So I think we're open to the opportunities. We're partnering with community organizations. We are throwing everything we have at it and thinking about this as a learning opportunity and a way for us to think different about what we're doing. We've double checked everything we've done, and we're doing everything the research and best practice tells us to do, and that we're still not getting the result that we were hoping for. So I think our bias right now is for class of 2021 and 2020 is to action. So we're continuing to push for college going as we get to the end of summer, and then we will transition to, because we're the community colleges, we also have short-term workforce training. And so we'll start pushing towards short-term workforce training and connect the short-term workforce training to college options. So to on-ramp students from short-term credentials, someone mentioned industry credentials, get students some credentials for entry-level jobs, and then try to parlay that into learn and earn type opportunities or financial aid with college going forward. And Anne's points are right. Students need a purpose and a reason. And so we'll continue at that. That's an agenda that we were on pre-pandemic and making progress forward. Someone had a question about dual enrollment, and we have been in the transition point of thinking about how do we move from a lot of dual enrollment, probably largely giving students who are heading to college more credits, and use dual enrollment as a strategy to engage students who were not sure or perhaps not college going before. So we're starting to build out our CTE, career technical education pathways, starting for dual college degrees and CTE areas starting in high school. So I think we're really interested in the work-based learning, but probably on the early side of that.
Well, thanks for that, Tammi. I saw a comment earlier from someone in Virginia about interest there in short-term work-facing credentials. I've been hearing anecdotally, and we've seen the data that young folks who are supporting their family by working are less likely to be enrolling in college. So it sounds, how do we, I'm going to start with Dave here, actually. From the findings that you've seen, how do we ensure that working opportunities can be tied to credentials that can be stacked up to a degree? I realize that's like the $1 million question here, the $1 trillion question. But anything you're seeing out there, anything about the interest that students or prospective students have in short-term credentials that we could leverage here?
Well, Tammy's just talked about her efforts, and Anne and I first met 15 years ago when she was innovating in California because of concerns about dropout rates in high school. And the solution there was the Irvine Foundation invested in developing a linked learning program that got written into the state constitution for funding and accreditation so that individuals could go to industry pathways that were and solutions. So you could go to healthcare high or high tech high or whatever the 33 industries across the state, and get both the college prep, the A through G credential pathway, and I can graduate and get a job as an EMT for $40,000 a year in Palmdale, right? And so you didn't have to choose, and they saw the relevance of learning through that lens. And I just think that experience, Paul, maybe these are the ingredients from the perspective of students and their families. Even the parents would say, well, my child would be better off going into a trade, but I want them to go to a school and a program that will open the door to college. they saw tracking as a threat to quality, right? And they wanted the best quality and opportunity for their children and for their community. So the "and" is really important. We were talking with Kim Hunter-Reid earlier this week, who's the Commissioner of Higher Education in the state of Louisiana. They've announced Louisiana Fast Forward initiative. By the year 2029, all high school graduates will graduate with either college credits or an industry certificate, right? And so they're doing this, and not just, as Tammi said, you know, me, I had AP chemistry and did chemistry labs up at the university, right? I was going to go to college and I just got 6 hours of credit sooner than I would have later. But these experiences that open people into there. So I just see so much of this, and across the research, the real point is there's emotional and rational dimensions in decision making. Emotionally, people believe higher education is good. It's desirable, sought after, should be recommended, valuable. They're not confident that they can translate a specific pathway into the outcome on a timeline and at a cost that will allow them to thrive and succeed. So all the proof points we can give them confidence, even if they don't take that exact path. Look, people like you come here, go through these programs, get hired at these places. That's the confidence people need, is the proof, not just the idea. And so all we can do, from everything I've seen, to promote that for reskilling workers, for young adults, I think that's the crisis that's the antidote to the crisis about value concerns.
Thanks, Dave. Anne, you want to jump in here?
No, I totally agree with Dave. I mean, ultimately, our battle is to get people to see the and not the or. And ultimately, those options and the self-agency is there if people are given the opportunity to discover. And we just believe and have seen the evidence of what happens when we start that earlier, right? That we can't wait to the doors of college to have young people begin to explore those options, right? I think the other point I would just add to Dave's is part of it is just clarity for young people, right? And part of, you know, the process of discovery is to be able to try things out and discover, equally importantly, that I have no interest in doing this. As one discovers, I do have interest in doing this, or this led me to something else. And those opportunities that really connect young people's aspirations with real informed opportunities for both higher education, credentialing, workforce kind of experiences that enable young people to try. Those are very, very critical. And I think ultimately giving clear signals, giving clear opportunities, providing clear information about the connection between educational pathways and career aspirations, and what people's passions are and what they care about and what their skills are and what they want to be doing with their life, is something that we all need to be engaging in at an earlier age for young people, if we're going to, you know, really stem this tide of disconnection. Because there are ways that we've learned, when young people see their purpose and have tangible experiences that show that purpose results in their own sense of fulfillment and self-agency and, frankly, success in both college and career, ultimately that inspires communities to do more of it. And that these are community solutions, right? For both economic and educational reasons.
And as policymaker, as we think about micro credentials or stackable credentials, industry credentials, I think it's really incumbent on us as policymakers and educators to be really informed and and provide options for students that have value for them. I think we've learned in the process that not every certificate is created equal. They don't all have value in the workplace at the same level. So, and I think some of it can be quite local. So, you know, what are the industry credentials that not just exist, because high schools don't always know. They need help. We all need help sorting through it. So what are the industry credentials that exist, and how do we make sure that those are the ones our employers value? So when students have them, they will lead to an employment that either provides a living wage or that is on a pathway to a living wage. And then on colleges incumbent on us to create pathways that lead from these perhaps non-credit opportunities into our degree programs. And that's a whole education process for the community, because I think too often it's easy for everyone to say the CNAs ought to be really close to getting an LPN. So, certified nurse assistant, that's nursing type experience, and people in the community being really frustrated that somehow can't just be topped off for a licensed practical nurse. But it turns out that's only a step on the pathway. It's an important step, and we need our nursing programs to figure out how they're going to acknowledge that step and give credit for it, but it doesn't get you 90% of the way towards a nursing degree, right? So that's education for everybody. And then figuring out, I just mentioned one thing about making this connection is that I think it's easy to say, well, it ought to lead to a nursing program, so it's connected. But we actually have to trailblaze the path with articulation agreements, with communication, with policy, so that our young people don't have to figure it out on their own, and that they can get the information early on about what their options are, especially if we're going to be doing offering our high school students training and certifications that are for very entry-level jobs. So I think that's where I worry about the tracking, is that if we think that an industry certification or stackable credential for something very entry level is a success on its own, and that we're done. So I think it's the new work ahead.
I would totally second that concern, Tammi.
Yeah, I mean, certainly hearing more about that from employers, that, taking on responsibility for that entry-level job, potentially leading to a career. And that gets me to an audience question, and keep them coming. I'm going to try to do that for the rest of the session here. And let's start with Tammi on this, the role of apprenticeships. How common are they in Hawaii? Could state and federal subsidies help? I mean, what's the outlook here?
So the outlook is apprenticeships are popular where we have them. Largely in Hawaii, they've largely been developed in skilled trades. We introduced more of them in healthcare, and that's a newer approach for us. We put together a proposal, which we just found out wasn't funded, by the Department of Labor, to expand our apprenticeships into new areas, and for the first time for Hawaii, into our credit programs. So can we create apprenticeships, so learn and earn opportunities for students in IT? And some of this, I think, really depends on the nature of your economy and what kind of employers you have. So in some communities, if you have really, really large specialized employers, you can have manufacturing, like advanced manufacturing apprenticeships. We just don't have that. So looking at what the opportunities are in your community for registered apprenticeships. So we're optimistic about expanding the registered apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships. And then again, making the connection between the experience that and credentials someone's going to get in an apprenticeship program, and leveraging that to be an on-ramp to earning a degree, because we still think degree has value for the long haul. So for example, our carpenters registered apprenticeship program, just talked to them this week, and if you complete the registered apprenticeship program, we have a degree that can be offered with some additional general education credits, so an AAS applied trades. And vice versa, our carpentry associates program will give students credit towards half their hours to completing the registered apprenticeship. So looking at those ways we can work together and give multiple on-ramps and off-ramps for students in between registered apprenticeships and degree programs.
Thanks for that. We just got a comment about a credit-bearing IT apprenticeship at Austin Community College. But to your point, Tammi, about this being about employers, the commenter said that local employer participation has been a challenge. So definitely need them at the table. Another question here, provocative one. How much do you see high school leaders and counselors perpetuating barriers and myths versus shifting them? And on the high school side, it's tough to generalize. I know the advice, the guidance here in this incredibly tough environment, is it evolving enough? What would you like to see?
I think it's a wonderful question. And I'll stick to the positive side of it, which I think that there are communities across this country that are really approaching these issues at a systemic level, right? I think often the work that we talk about is very silo. It's very sort of exists in spite of the system as opposed to because of it, right? And so if we're going to really drive the kind of change, right, to see very integrated counseling across a high school experience, right, that's totally tied to college and career preparation, right? People have to address that as a system, right? They have to say, this is towards our vision of what we believe all young people should be graduating with. We need to work as a system with the partners on the ground, employers, educators, post-secondary partners, our K-12 leaders and educators, right, to make that change happen, right? So I would say that we find incredible energy in communities and large urban school districts, small rural communities that are really taking on this challenge together with their communities, right? To really think about what does a high school education bring a young person? What's the profile we seek at the end of that journey, right? For our communities and for those young people and their families. So I think we are really energized by the communities that are doing that really at scale and impacting hundreds of thousands of young people. And I think that's so I think, yes, is there always work to do? Totally. But there are so many wonderful examples across California, in the middle of our country, on the East Coast, where people are really taking on these bigger systemic issues and saying that's our challenge, is to do this at scale.
Well, I may just interject, but in work we've done with college graduates and asking them about how they'd like to stay connected to education, their overwhelming interest and willingness to do job talks, to mentor, to let someone career shadow, and that interest in their communities extends not just to their alma maters for their undergraduate degree, but all the way into their community. So there is a great willingness, sometimes with our overwhelmed K through 12 leaders and counselors and teachers, if we can help them be gateways and portals into those opportunities to connect with the community. I've seen so many community-based and faith-based organizations that are just devoted to that work and are willing to step in. And that's another place where sometimes schools want parents and communities to be arm's length, right? And so how can we be welcoming both, if we're at a community college or a four-year university, of somebody who's in a profession giving credit hours for an apprenticeship, rather than the, in my classroom taking my test getting credit, or to the engagement and communication with the students in my high school and middle school and things. There's a lot of goodwill throughout the people of our nation.
Tammi, anything you want to add on the high school messaging side?
I think one of the things that I find in this pandemic time to be true in many groups is what Dave found in the survey with the students, or the study with the students, is that the anxiousness that people feel is not just with young people, it's with our adults. And how I think that's a challenge for all of us. How do we move to action at this time when there's still so much uncertainty about returning, restarting education, and so this is not directly answering your question, but just I wanted to point out to everyone, I think it'll be easy, 5 years from now, to look at the trend data and say, put an asterisk next to 2020 and 2021 and say, pandemic. And I think, we'll explain it away from a data point of view, but when we really think about the number of young people whose trajectory will change because of the pandemic and because of the choices that are offered to them and that they make, and then for high school graduates in the next 6 months, that'll change their life trajectory. And there's plenty of research about past recessions and how they have really negative impacts, lifetime impacts on earnings, health, and such are really sobering. So I think, how do we all rally at this time? I have a lot of high school principals who are now really wanting to know what kind of opportunities are available to offer to grads who are coming back, to say like, okay, now what? Because that's the place they still know. And they're really excited about being able to share information about job training, for example. And I think my main concern for the moment is, how do we make sure young people are getting connected to something that's productive? If they're working, if they're in a job, what I don't want them to be doing is sitting on the couch playing video games a year and a half later, which some of them are still doing from the class of 2020. So just making sure they're like, how do we all work together? And that's been, and I would say this anxiety and uncertainty, and that has created this paralysis among a lot of different people. I think that applies to adults, even some of our community partners. We're like, okay, our Native Hawaiian college going is down 21% from class of 2020. And our applications are really down. It doesn't look good for this year. What's happening and what can we do? And I think a lot of people are still trying to process like what's happening. There's a lot of reasons and wonderings. And the actions we're taking, like I mentioned in the chat, some of the actions we're taking, we're doing the things that were successful before and they're not as successful this year. So that's frustrating for everybody, but we just gotta keep on keeping on, moving in a forward direction, I think.
Well, let me build on that. To avoid the asterisk mentality for these two classes, I'm going to start with Dave and then turn to Ann. What are one or two of the lessons that we've learned from the challenges these classes have faced that we need to keep the eye on the ball with the future classes and not be expecting a return to the status quo? Dave, any top challenge you want to leave folks with, lesson of how to deal with it?
I think it's not just saying it louder and saying it more slowly and expecting people to absorb it. They need to feel heard. And so finding both systems and the individual outreach, as Tammy's just articulated her tireless efforts to really understand what's happening in those communities and keep going, but keep being open and listening and engaging. And I think Ann said earlier, these are community solutions. And so how do we do that to help the families that are feeling uncertain, the young people that are feeling the burden and the hopes? And so specifically, how do we translate that? There's lots of innovation and solutions and hard work, but I think that's at the core across the body of research that we see.
Thanks, Dave. Ann?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think listening to the voices of young people, they know more than we do about what they're experiencing, what's going to help them reconnect. I think we do know that relationships are really, really important right now, and relevance and the connection of career and college and what are they doing today really going to make a difference for what they want to do in the future. And ultimately, I think this is a time where we do have an opportunity, if we're purposeful, to say, we're not, to Tammy's point, I've heard a lot of people saying, well, we're just going to write off these kids. It was terrible this happened to them, but you know what, actually, we could have a very purposeful and deliberate campaign that really focuses on hearing their voices, figuring out what we want to do, transforming the silos of education, workforce, higher ed into dynamic and systemic networks of educators and employers and leaders who are really ensuring that these young people don't move from disruption to disconnection permanently. It's in all of our interests, our nation's interest economically, to think creatively and with hope, because I think our young people have hope. We need to help them reconnect it to their sense of purpose.
Well, that's a good note to end on. And thank you, Tammi. Thanks so much for sharing what's happening in your state. And Dave and Strada, thanks for the findings on this important topic. And thanks to all of you for attending. I just read that not only will the recording of this be shared with you, but also the chat. A lot of action in there, a lot of links. So again, thanks for your time.
Thank you, everyone.